It was supposed to be a routine day, just like any other. The judge, a well-dressed, composed black man, was driving home after a long day in court. The sun was setting, painting the sky in warm hues, and the faint sound of jazz filled his car. But then, flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror, and everything changed. The officer, a stern-faced white man, approached the vehicle with an air of authority that seemed to tip into hostility. "License and registration," he barked, without offering a reason for the stop. The judge, calm and respectful, handed over his documents, but the officer's demeanor only grew colder. "Is this car even yours?" The cop sneered, his tone laced with suspicion. The judge's calm reply seemed to irritate him further. The tension was palpable, and passers-by began to slow down, sensing that something wasn't right. What the officer didn't know was that he had just pulled over one of the most respected judges in the state, and what happened next would flip the entire situation on its head, leaving everyone, the cop, the judge, and even the bystanders, utterly speechless. Stay tuned to find out how this jaw-dropping encounter unfolds. The officer glanced at the judge's license, his eyes narrowing as he tapped it against his palm. "A judge, huh?" he muttered, almost to himself, as if the title didn't fit the man sitting before him. He took a step back, resting his hand on his belt, where his radio sat, his expression unreadable. The judge, still calm but now visibly curious, spoke up. "Officer, may I ask why I was stopped?" His voice was steady, but there was an undertone of quiet authority. It wasn't confrontational, just a question that carried the weight of someone who understood the law. But instead of answering, the officer leaned in closer. "Where are you headed tonight?" he asked, ignoring the question entirely. There was something about his tone, sharp, questioning, that made the judge feel as though he were being sized up. Other cars passed slowly now, drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. The officer's behavior wasn't just drawing attention, it was fueling unease. Inside his car, the judge remained composed, but thoughts raced through his mind. Was this about the car, his appearance, or something deeper? The officer stepped away, reaching for his radio. Whatever was coming next, it felt like a storm was brewing. As the officer reached for his radio, the judge felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew that any wrong move could escalate the situation. Meanwhile, a passerby, a young woman with a phone in hand, began recording the interaction, her eyes wide with concern. Unbeknownst to the officer, this footage could soon spread far beyond this quiet street. Inside the patrol car, the officer spoke into his radio, his voice low but firm. "We have a situation here. A black man claiming to be a judge. Proceed with caution." Moments later, another officer arrived, standing beside his partner with a skeptical gaze. The tension between the two men was palpable, each sensing the gravity of the encounter. Back in the judge's car, he glanced at his phone, contemplating whether to call his legal team. He had handled many courtroom battles, but this was different. This was personal. His mind raced with memories of past injustices and the importance of standing his ground. The bystanders continued to watch, whispers spreading through the crowd as the standoff persisted. Suddenly, the second officer approached, his expression unreadable. He asked to see the judge's ID once more, his tone less hostile but still guarded. The judge complied, feeling the weight of every second ticking by. Just as it seemed a resolution might be within reach, the first officer interrupted, his frustration evident. "Something doesn't add up here," he declared. The air was heavy with tension as the first officer paced back and forth, the sound of his boots scraping against the pavement. The judge remained calm, but his sharp eyes took in every detail, the officer's rigid posture, the crowd quietly gathering, and the second officer's shifting expressions. It was clear this was no routine stop anymore. "You sure this ID is real?" The first officer snapped, holding the judge's license up as if inspecting a counterfeit. His voice carried an edge that made the onlookers shift uncomfortably. The second officer hesitated before responding, his tone less confrontational. Everything looks fine to me, but maybe we should run it through the system. The judge's composure never wavered, though inside he felt a mix of frustration and resolve. He knew he couldn't let the situation spiral, but he also couldn't ignore what was unfolding. "Officer," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the growing murmur of the crowd, "I've cooperated fully. If there's a legitimate issue, let's address it. Otherwise, I'd like to be on my way." The first officer froze, his face darkening as though the judge's calm assertion was a challenge. The second officer, seemingly caught between loyalties, glanced nervously at his partner. But before anyone could respond, a voice from the crowd spoke up. "Is this really necessary? We're all watching." The officer's head snapped toward the crowd, his frustration now mingling with uncertainty. The tension reached its peak as the first officer turned back to the judge, his hand hovering near his belt. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, and the judge's heart pounded as he prepared for what might come next. The judge hesitated for a moment, weighing his options. He understood the gravity of the situation. Any sudden movement could shift the narrative in an instant. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out with a quiet dignity that made the crowd hold their breath. The officer, however, seemed unimpressed, his hands still hovering near his belt. "Hands where I can see them," the officer barked. The judge complied, raising his hands slightly, his expression calm but unwavering. The second officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between his partner and the growing crowd. As the judge stood there, a car pulled up nearby. A well-dressed woman stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice steady but commanding. The crowd murmured in recognition. It was the district attorney. The first officer froze, his confidence faltering. "This doesn't concern you," he said sharply, though his tone lacked the same edge as before. "Oh, it absolutely concerns me," she shot back, pulling out her phone. "That man is a sitting judge, and unless you have legitimate cause, this is harassment." The crowd buzzed with whispers as the officer's face flushed. For a moment, it seemed like the situation might de-escalate, but then the radio on his shoulder crackled to life, and a voice on the other end said something that made his jaw tighten. He glanced at his partner, then back at the judge, his next move unpredictable. The stakes had just been raised, and the crowd braced for what would happen next. The officer's jaw tightened as the radio crackled again, and the voice on the other end repeated a name. It was the judge's name. His partner leaned in, whispering something that seemed to unsettle him even more. The first officer took a step back, his face a mix of frustration and disbelief. Meanwhile, the district attorney crossed her arms, her expression unrelenting. "Well," she pressed, "what's the issue here? Or are we going to keep embarrassing ourselves in front of half the neighborhood?" The officer finally lowered his hand from his belt. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding," he muttered, avoiding eye contact with the judge. He turned to his partner, who nodded awkwardly, clearly relieved the situation was diffusing. But just as the tension seemed to break, the judge spoke up, his voice steady but firm. "Before I leave, I'd like to know why I was stopped in the first place." His question hung in the air, demanding an answer. The first officer hesitated, then finally admitted, "There was a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description. It was flagged, and we were told to investigate." His words were quick, as if trying to end the conversation. The judge nodded, his composure unshaken. "I see," he said. "Then perhaps next time, start with that instead of assumptions." As he stepped back toward his car, the district attorney followed, her voice low but pointed. "You'll be hearing from my office," she told the officers, who now looked thoroughly uncomfortable. But just as the judge opened his car door, the young woman who had been recording stepped forward, her phone still in hand. "Excuse me, sir," she said to the judge. "I think you should see this." She played back her recording, and to everyone's shock, it revealed the officer's initial approach. His first words weren't about a stolen vehicle. They were an offhand comment, questioning how the judge could afford the car. The crowd erupted in murmurs, and the district attorney's face hardened. The judge glanced at the officers, his expression unreadable. Without saying another word, he got into his car and drove away, leaving the officers to face the crowd and a story that was far from over. As the judge drove away, the crowd lingered, their murmurs growing louder. The recording had changed everything. What started as a tense traffic stop had turned into a moment of reckoning, not just for the officers, but for everyone who witnessed it. The district attorney stayed behind, speaking firmly to the officers. "This isn't going away," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll be reviewing this incident thoroughly." The younger officer nodded, visibly shaken, while the first officer looked at the ground, his earlier confidence completely gone. Meanwhile, the young woman who had recorded the video posted it online, captioning it, "When the truth comes out." Within hours, the clip began to circulate, sparking conversations about accountability, bias, and the importance of standing up for what's right. As for the judge, he returned home that evening, tired but resolute. He knew this was not just about him, it was about the bigger picture. In the days that followed, he used his platform to address systemic issues, turning an uncomfortable moment into a catalyst for change. The story didn't just end with justice being sought. It became a reminder that even small actions, like speaking up or recording the truth, can lead to powerful change.